Hello there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. So I'm sitting here currently just editing a completely different video at the moment, and while that video was exporting and I was waiting to finish it up, I just went online and looked at some news articles about what's going on today, and one of the news articles that I saw was about two rallies that were going on in the United Kingdom surrounding the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland. I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty around it, but for those of you who don't know, the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland was recently passed in Scotland, but then turned down by the UK, and the act itself was about supporting trans people and giving trans people better access to be able to change their gender marker on their documents. Now, this has been made a big sort of rallying cry for gender critical feminists, aka TERFs, in the United Kingdom, and they made it sort of the big issue that they, you can't, help the transes, it'll cause, trans people to become allowed to be rapists and into women's spaces and all of that regular nonsense that we hear from gender critical folks. Anyways, that's like the very broad version of this. There's a lot more nuance to it, but surrounding that discussion that's going on in the UK right now, there was a protest held by gender-critical TERFs in the UK that were rallying against trans rights, and a counter-protest in support of trans people and trans rights came up against it, which is awesome. Hell yes, push back against the fascist folks pushing fascist rhetoric. I'm all support that. That's absolutely amazing. Those people are doing amazing work. However, the article that I was looking at, I always get angry at these types of articles and how many people in the media, especially those in the UK, frame discussions around trans issues, because they always frame it as, like, again, gender criticals versus trans people, TERFs versus trans people, when that's not really the way that we should be framing things. These things are not as opposites. TERFs are literally trying to create this conversation about cis women versus trans women, and I hate that distinction. And by framing it that way, it ignores that we should have solidarity between trans and cisgender women to create a fight pushing back against patriarchy and authoritarian systems that ultimately all push us down. But anyways, I've gone way further down that rabbit hole than I really wanted to, because the one thing that I did want to point out about this article was they showed a bunch of pictures of, like, TERFs and trans people, and, like, the TERFs are all wearing nice suits. Again, sort of this idea of, like, traditional rationality, like establishment femininity. It's very much this idea of, like, conservative femininity that gender critical folks espouse, and then they sort of frame it against pictures of trans people with, like, colorful hair, vibrant outfits, which I think is awesome. But there's clearly sort of this idea of playing into a bias of, like, oh, it's like weird freakish people that are supporting trans people. And again, I'm all here for, like, the over the top colorful people. It's just interesting how the audience of these news articles will sort of take that. It's very clearly how they're trying to frame these sort of things. But one photo in particular stood out to me amongst the rest, and that is this picture that I'm putting on the screen of Grand Lineham standing amongst the gender-critical crowd. Yes, Glitter himself, who is known for his very anti-trans views, is standing out amongst the crowd. And it's so interesting to me that this is the picture that they decided to show, because it's Grand Lineham just sort of standing in the middle of a bunch of women, and it's about, theoretically, this rally is about women's rights, women's sex-based rights. And yet the camera decides to linger on Grand Lineham, the one man in that image, how he stands above all the rest. And the camera is just focusing in on him. And it's just, this picture, for me, I don't think they intended this, but it just symbolizes to me a lot of what gender critical movements are about, what TERF movements are about, that there's these women that are there believing that they're standing up for women's rights, but ultimately they're just focusing on this patriarchal view of men as stronger and women as inherently weaker and needing protection because their rights are under attack, and how it's all ultimately part of the same system that venerates men. It's just fascinating to me that just Glinner is just standing there in the middle of a crowd and the camera's just focused on him. How in amongst a sea of women, the news media only wish to focus on the one dude who is in the crowd, the most famous man in the crowd. That's all that really was of interest to this camera person taking this image. I'm sure this camera person took many, many more images, but the news article decided to use this specific one. Just underscores this narrative that the media is ultimately playing into, and how TERFs are ultimately playing into, this sort of veneration of a patriarchal and authoritarian society that gender critical movements ultimately all uphold. And they do this all with zero self-awareness of what they are doing, just like how all the women in this picture have zero awareness of the person taking the camera or the system that ultimately chose this image over all the other ones to place in the news article. A crowd of women who are ultimately all there to try to oppress a minority and don't realize that they're all ultimately hurting themselves. So yeah, this image of Glinner just weirdly encapsulated all of that for me.